The dust kicked up from the gravel road as Sergeant Margaret, Maggie, Hartwell drove the supply truck toward Fort Harmony, an isolated military installation nestled in the pine forests of North Carolina. It was June 1944, and America was at war. The radio crackled with updates about the beaches of Normandy, where soldiers were dying by the thousands. Maggie's hands gripped the steering wheel tight, her jaw clenched with determination. At 23 years old, she had already lived 100 lives. She wore her uniform with pride, even though every single day someone reminded her she didn't belong in it. Fort Harmony was not an ordinary base. It was a prisoner of war camp, one of dozens scattered across America. After Pearl Harbor and the brutal campaigns across the Pacific, tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers had been captured and shipped back to the United States. They needed to be kept somewhere, fed, managed. Congress had decided they would be scattered throughout America, worked on farms, used in factories, put to productive use while they waited for the war to end. Nobody had asked the American people if they wanted Japanese prisoners living near their towns. Maggie pulled the truck through the front gate. A young private saluted, then did a double take. She was a woman. The look on his face said everything: confusion, then dismissal, then something that looked like pity. She had seen that look 1,000 times in the past 6 months. "Morning, sir," the private said, then caught himself. "Ma'am, sorry." "No trouble," Maggie said, her voice steady and professional. She had a southern accent that came from her daddy, a sharecropper's daughter who had no business wearing stars and stripes. But here she was anyway. Maggie's appointment as a supply sergeant at Fort Harmony had been a fluke. The Army needed someone to manage inventory for the growing number of prisoners. Most of the officers had gone overseas. The pool of qualified candidates was thin. Maggie had scored highest on the tests, so they gave her the job, but everyone, absolutely everyone, seemed to regret it. The base commander, Colonel Merritt, was a man in his 60s with silver hair and the posture of a man who had served his country for 40 years. When Maggie reported to his office on her first day, he had looked at her the way someone might look at a strange animal that had wandered into their living room. "You're the supply sergeant," he said, not as a greeting but as a statement of disbelief. "Yes, sir," Maggie said. "You understand this is a military installation. These are prisoners of war, Japanese prisoners of war, some of the most dangerous men on this earth." "Yes, sir." "You will be coordinating supplies for nearly 500 men. You will be managing rations, clothing, medical supplies, fuel, and materials. You will be doing this work in an environment where security is paramount." "Yes, sir. I'm prepared to do the job, sir." Colonel Merritt had studied her for a long moment. She could see him calculating. Could he refuse her assignment? Probably not. The paperwork had been filed. The decision had been made by people above his pay grade, but he clearly didn't like it. "See that you do," he said finally. Dismissed. That had been the beginning of 6 months of cold shoulders and whispered comments. The other officers treated her like a secretary who had accidentally wandered onto the base. When she attended strategy meetings, they spoke as if she wasn't there. When she asked questions, they answered with exasperation. When she pointed out that their supply calculations were incorrect, they checked her work, found that she was right, and resented her for it. The enlisted men were sometimes worse. There were jokes about her being in the wrong barracks. There were comments about her appearance, some mocking, some inappropriate. There was a betting pool. She had learned about how long she would last before she quit and went back to being a secretary or a nurse or whatever women were supposed to do in this war. Maggie had ignored all of it. She had grown up learning to be tough. Her mother had died when she was 12. Her father had raised her and her 3 brothers on nothing but grit and hard work. She could plow a field. She could slaughter a pig. She could negotiate with suppliers who thought they could cheat a woman. She could look a man in the eye and tell him he was wrong without flinching. She had learned early that the world didn't have much use for girls, but it had no choice but to respect competence. So Maggie did her job perfectly. She managed the inventory systems better than her predecessor had. She identified inefficiencies in the supply chain and corrected them. She worked 16-hour days when necessary. She filed her reports on time, and they were meticulous. And she told nobody how lonely it was. The supply depot was a large warehouse structure on the eastern side of the base. It was separate from the main camp where the prisoners were housed, but close enough that Maggie could see the barbed wire fences and the guard towers from her office window. She spent most of her time in the warehouse itself, organizing goods, checking manifests, preparing shipments. It was a hot morning in late June when Captain Harold Dennison walked into her office. Dennison was the officer in charge of prisoner management. He was younger than Colonel Merritt, probably in his early 40s, and he had the kind of confidence that came from being very sure he was the smartest person in any room. Maggie had had 3 interactions with him since arriving at the base. In each one, he had treated her like she was a nuisance. "Sergeant Hartwell," he said, not bothering with any preamble, "we have a situation." "Yes, sir," Maggie said, looking up from her inventory ledger. "The prisoner population is becoming restless. Morale is deteriorating. The men are bored. Boredom leads to discipline problems. Discipline problems lead to escape attempts." Maggie nodded, waiting for him to continue. "I need you to review the rations we're providing. They're adequate by Army standards, but I want to know if there's any way to improve them. Something psychological, you understand. Make the men feel like they're being treated well. Make them content." Maggie's first instinct was to bristle. The prisoners were enemy soldiers. They had fought against America. They had killed Americans. Why should she be concerned about making them feel content? But she was also a professional. "I'll review the current dietary plan," she said. "What kind of improvements are you looking for?" "Anything that creates positive sentiment. Extra portions. Better variety, treats perhaps. I want them to remember America as a place that treated them well even in captivity. That might prevent incidents. That might make them easier to manage." It was not a stupid strategy, Maggie had to admit. And it wasn't cruel either. It was pragmatic. "I'll put together a report," she said. Dennison nodded, satisfied. He was already turning to leave when he said, "And Sergeant, try not to break anything while you're doing this. I know paperwork is challenging for some people." He left before she could respond. Maggie felt the anger rise in her chest, hot and quick. She set down her pen carefully. She closed her eyes. She counted to 10. This was the part of her job nobody talked about in the recruitment office. This was what it meant to be a woman soldier in 1944. You weren't allowed to fail because you would take all women with you. You weren't allowed to cry because that would prove you were too emotional. You weren't allowed to get angry because that would prove you were irrational. You had to be perfect while being treated like you were fundamentally incompetent. She had learned to live with it, but that didn't mean it didn't hurt. Over the next week, Maggie dove into research. She looked at what the prisoners were being fed. She compared it to Army nutritional standards. She looked at what was available in the supply chain. She considered costs and logistics. And she started thinking about what made people feel valued, even in bad circumstances. She had grown up poor. She knew what it meant to be hungry. She knew that sometimes a small kindness, an extra biscuit at dinner, a piece of candy at Christmas, could mean the difference between hope and despair. The prisoners at Fort Harmony were living in a country that was at war with them. They were far from home, in a place where they didn't speak the language, where they didn't understand the culture. Many of them probably wondered if they would ever see their families again. That didn't make them less dangerous, but it did make them human. Maggie compiled a report suggesting an expanded diet. She included items like fresh fruit when it was in season, which it would be soon. She suggested slightly larger portions of bread and protein. She recommended a weekly treat, cookies, candy, or extra coffee. The cost would be minimal, she calculated. The psychological benefit would be significant. She typed it up carefully, checked it twice for errors, and submitted it to Captain Dennison. He sent it back with a note. "Acceptable, implement beginning July 1st. That was all, no credit, no acknowledgement of the work, just orders to proceed. Maggie implemented the changes. The prisoners noticed immediately. She didn't see them directly. Military protocol kept the female staff members separated from the prisoner population. But she heard about it through the enlisted men who worked in the mess hall. The prisoners had become quieter, more orderly. They were smiling more, apparently. There had been 0 escape attempts in the 2 weeks since the new rations had begun. Captain Dennison took the credit, of course. She heard him mention it to Colonel Merritt during a meeting she was attending to present quarterly supply figures. "The new dietary approach is working remarkably well," he said. "We've achieved a significant improvement in prisoner morale and behavior." Colonel Merritt nodded, impressed. Maggie said nothing. She presented her figures, all accurate, all documented. She answered questions. She was dismissed. As she was leaving the office, Colonel Merritt called her back. "Sergeant Hartwell," he said, That dietary plan was that Captain Dennison's idea. Maggie hesitated. In the army, there was a chain of command. Officers received credit, soldiers did not. But she was also sworn to tell the truth. "It was my recommendation, sir," she said carefully. "Captain Dennison approved it." Colonel Merritt nodded slowly. She couldn't read his expression. "I see," he said, dismissed. She never knew if he believed her, and it wouldn't have mattered if he did. Officers protected other officers. That was how the system worked. But something had shifted, though Maggie wouldn't fully understand it until later. Over the following weeks, as July turned to August and the summer heat pressed down on North Carolina, something unexpected happened. The prisoners adapted. The rations stopped feeling like a treat and started feeling normal. The morale boost was temporary. Restlessness began creeping back in. Captain Dennison came to her office again, this time with a new problem. "We need something else," he said without preamble. "The men are becoming difficult again. We're losing the positive effect." "Adaptation," Maggie said quietly. "They got used to the change." "Well, get them unused to it," Dennison said sharply. "I don't care how, think of something." He left. Maggie sat in her office, looking out at the guard towers in the distance. The prisoners were living in a different world than she was, separated by barbed wire and suspicion. But they were still human beings. They still needed hope. They still needed to feel like they mattered. And she was the only one around who seemed to care about that. She thought about her childhood again. What had made her feel better on the hardest days? What had reminded her that the world was not entirely made of work and struggle? Small things, mostly. The taste of cold water on a hot day, the smell of her mother's perfume in the dresser, a joke that made her laugh, a moment of connection with another person, a reminder that life contained joy, not just survival. She looked at her supply manifests. Fort Harmony received regular shipments from regional warehouses. Most of it was standard military fare, canned vegetables, powdered eggs, flour, salt, coffee. But sometimes there were other things, treats meant for the officers' clubs, specialty items for holidays. Maggie made a decision. She opened a new requisition form. At the bottom, in the section marked Special Orders, she typed, "Request permission to add Coca-Cola and sandwich supplies to prisoner rations, weekly distribution. Coca-Cola represents American culture and goodwill. Sandwiches provide variety. Recommend trial period of 4 weeks." She sent it to Dennison. He sent it back rejected. "Cost prohibitive, find a different solution." Maggie looked at her budget. She was efficient. She always came in under budget. She had never spent her discretionary funds on anything. There was a small surplus in her quarterly allocation. The first shipment arrived on a Tuesday morning in early August. Maggie had arranged it carefully, using a supplier in the nearby town of Ashford. They were providing Coca-Cola and supplies for sandwiches, lunch meat, cheese, fresh bread, on her own dime. A portion of it would go to the officers' club, a perfectly normal purchase. But another portion had been quietly shifted to the prisoner accounts. It was a small rebellion, but it was rebellion nonetheless. Maggie knew the risks. She was appropriating military supplies, technically. She was making decisions outside her authority. She was spending her own money to benefit enemy prisoners. If anyone found out, her career was over. Court-martial, possibly. But she also knew something that the other officers didn't seem to understand. Humanity was contagious. If you treated people like they mattered, sometimes they started acting like they mattered. And perhaps, just perhaps, that mattered in ways that mattered more than regulations. She had a local supplier deliver the goods to the warehouse after hours, disguising it as a routine delivery. She worked alone that evening, rearranging the manifest to hide the transaction among dozens of other line items. It was the kind of careful, methodical work she had learned growing up with a family that didn't have enough money for mistakes. The first sandwiches and sodas were distributed to the prisoners on a Friday evening, with Captain Dennison's authorization, but without him understanding where they had actually come from. Maggie had written another memo, suggesting a trial program of American cultural experience, food items, and Dennison had approved it without reading carefully. He just wanted the problem solved. She waited for word of how the prisoners reacted. The reports came back through the mess hall workers and the guards. The Japanese prisoners had been stunned silent when they received their sandwiches. One older man had actually cried. They had drank the Coca-Cola slowly, savoring it like it was the most valuable thing in the world. There had been no incidents, no discipline problems. The mood had been remarkably calm. One of the mess hall workers, a kid named Rodriguez who was from Texas and couldn't have been more than 20, came to talk to Maggie directly. "You should have seen them, Sergeant," he said, excitement in his voice. "Those prisoners, I mean, they looked at those sandwiches like you gave them gold. One of the older guys, he showed the other prisoners how to eat it American style with all the ingredients together, not picking it apart. They were smiling, just smiling. Most of them don't hardly ever smile." "That's good," Maggie said. "That's what we're going for." "Ma'am, if you don't mind me saying, that was real nice, what you did." She did mind him saying it, actually, because kindness made her want to cry and she never cried. But she said, "It's just food, Rodriguez, everyone eats." "Maybe," he said, "but not everyone treats prisoners like people who deserve to eat something good." He left before she could respond. Maggie sat at her desk, her hands shaking slightly. She had always believed in doing the right thing, but she had never expected gratitude for it. Gratitude was dangerous. Gratitude made you feel like what you were doing mattered, and if it mattered, then failing would hurt more. She had learned a long time ago not to expect things to matter. But something was shifting inside her anyway. Over the next 2 weeks, Maggie continued the program. She carefully managed the budget, hiding the expenditures in plain sight. She wrote memos that were technically true but carefully worded to obscure the details. She became very good at making 2 and 2 add up to 5 in the supply spreadsheets, all while keeping everything balanced and accurate in her private records. It was a form of lying, and she knew it. But sometimes lying was necessary to protect people who had no power to protect themselves. In mid-August, Captain Dennison called her back to his office. "The prisoner morale continues to improve," he said. "Well done, Sergeant. Whatever you changed in the dietary program is working. We're seeing increased productivity in their work assignments and a significant decrease in disciplinary incidents." "Thank you, sir," Maggie said. The prisoners have actually been asking, through the interpreters, if they could continue receiving these items. They're calling it American food. They seem to think it's a privilege they're being granted. Maggie's heart jumped. The prisoners were asking for it, which meant it was working, which meant it mattered. "We could institute it permanently," she offered. "I could budget for it." Dennison shook his head. No, privileges are meant to be occasional. If we make it regular, it loses its value. But a weekly distribution seems reasonable. Keep them wanting more. That's good psychology." "Yes, sir." "You've done well here, Sergeant. I'm going to recommend to Colonel Merritt that you receive commendation for your work on prisoner morale enhancement." Maggie froze. Commendation meant attention. Attention meant scrutiny. Scrutiny meant someone might actually look at her budget carefully. "That's not necessary, sir," she said carefully. "I think it is. You've solved a problem that was becoming serious. That's commendable work." After she left his office, Maggie felt panic rising in her chest. She went to her warehouse office and closed the door. She looked at her ledgers. The entries were clean, but if someone really examined them, really dug into the details, they would see the discrepancies. She could confess now. She could explain what she had done and why. She could probably limit the damage if she controlled the narrative. Or she could be very careful from this moment forward to cover her tracks better. She spent the rest of the day adjusting her records. She was good with numbers. She had always been good with numbers. By the time she left that evening, she had redistributed the costs across multiple line items, made everything balance perfectly, and ensured that there was no paper trail directly connecting her purchases to the prisoner supplies. It was illegal. She was aware of that, but so was denying food to people who deserved it. That weekend, Maggie walked through the small town of Ashford, which was the nearest civilian population center to the base. It was a typical American town, a main street with shops, a diner, a movie theater, a church. Maggie had been to Ashford several times, usually just to buy necessities, but today she went to the library. The librarian was a woman probably in her 70s, with kind eyes and a patient voice. Maggie had never spoken to her before. "I'd like books about Japan," Maggie said. "About Japanese culture, their language, their traditions." The librarian smiled. "Research." "Personal interest," Maggie said, which was not quite a lie. The librarian directed her to a small section. There wasn't much, a travel guide that was probably outdated, a book about Japanese art, a dictionary. Maggie checked them all out. That evening, in her small room at the base, which she shared with nobody, the army had finally given her private quarters, mostly because no one else wanted to room with her. Maggie started reading. She learned that Japan was an island nation, beautiful and crowded. She learned that their art was elegant and precise. She learned that they had a concept of honor that was central to everything. She learned that their soldiers were trained to see surrender as shameful, which meant that the men at Fort Harmony were already dealing with profound psychological trauma, captured and far from home, living in a country that hated them. That made the sandwiches and sodas seem even more important. She read the dictionary, trying to understand the sounds of their language. She couldn't learn Japanese in a few days, but she could learn a few words. A greeting, a thank you, how to say welcome. The book about art fascinated her. There was a section on gardens, on the philosophy of finding beauty in simplicity, on the idea that nature could be contemplated and appreciated. That seemed important somehow. In a life of captivity, in a prisoner of war camp surrounded by barbed wire, what would people need to see? Beauty. Evidence that the world contained beauty. Maggie didn't know what she was going to do with this knowledge yet. She just knew she needed to have it. In the third week of August, something unexpected happened. Maggie was working alone in the warehouse, as she usually did in the evenings after the other workers had gone home. She was inventorying a new shipment of flour when she heard a noise near the loading dock. She tensed, her hand moving automatically to the whistle she kept in her pocket. "Hello," she called out. "Who's there?" A figure emerged from behind a stack of crates. It was a prisoner. Maggie's first instinct was alarm. Then she looked at him more carefully. He was older, probably in his 50s, with gray at his temples. He wore the standard prisoner uniform and had the clear prisoner identification on his sleeve. He did not appear to be armed or dangerous. "I am very sorry," he said in heavily accented English. "Very sorry, I did not mean to frighten you." "How did you get in here?" Maggie demanded. "I work in the warehouse, carry supplies. The guard, he went to dinner. The gate was not closed all the way. I came in to see if I could find you." He paused, struggling for words. "I wanted to thank you for the food, the American food." Maggie's mouth went dry. This was extremely dangerous. Fraternization with prisoners was prohibited. If anyone found out she had been alone with him, the consequences would be severe. "You need to go," she said. "Now, before someone sees you." "I know," the prisoner said. "I am sorry, I will go, but first I want to thank you. I am Major Takeshi Yamamoto, and I am an officer in the Japanese army. I am far from home. My family, I do not know if they are alive. My country is losing the war. I think I will never go home." He paused. He was a soldier like her. He was wearing a uniform for his country, just as she was wearing a uniform for hers. "But last week," he continued, "I ate a sandwich, and I drank a Coca-Cola. And I remembered that the world was not only war, that there was food made with care, that there were people who could still see us as human beings even though we were enemies. That was a very small thing, but it was very important to me." Maggie didn't know what to say. "Thank you," he said, and bowed deeply, the way she had read about in her library books. It was a gesture of profound respect. "Thank you for reminding me that I am human." He straightened and turned to leave. "Wait," Maggie said. He turned back. "What is your name?" she asked. "Your first name." "Takeshi," he said. "Takeshi," she repeated, testing the sound. "I am Margaret. You can call me Margaret." He nodded. "Margaret, a strong name, strong woman. I can see this about you." "You should go," she said, but gently. "If anyone finds you here." "I know I will be punished. You will also be punished, perhaps. I understand the risk I am taking." "Then why did you do it?" He smiled sadly. "Because I wanted someone to know that your kindness was received, that it mattered, that in this terrible time, in this terrible war, someone in this uniform, someone who fights for the other side, still understood that you did something good." He left before she could respond. Maggie stood alone in the warehouse, her heart pounding. What she had just done was evidence. She had spoken with a prisoner alone, without witnesses, without authorization. If anyone found out, if Takeshi got caught and mentioned her name, everything would fall apart. But she would do it again. She knew that even as the fear flooded through her. Some things mattered more than regulations. Over the following days, Maggie was hyper-aware of every interaction at the base. She waited for consequences that never came. Take she was not caught, or if he was, he didn't give her name to anyone. She continued her work as if nothing had happened, but something had fundamentally changed inside her. She had believed before that doing the right thing was important. Now she knew it with a bone-deep certainty that wouldn't leave her. In early September, Captain Dennison informed her that he would be rotating out of Fort Harmony. He was being reassigned to a base in California. His replacement would be Captain James Hodges, an officer who came highly recommended and had previous experience managing prisoner populations. "You'll brief him on the current situation," Dennison said. "The prisoner morale program, the diet adjustments, all of it. He should understand how we've achieved such good outcomes here." "Yes, sir," Maggie said. What she didn't say was that she was afraid. She had learned how to navigate Dennison. She had learned where his blind spots were. A new officer meant a new beginning, and new beginnings were dangerous. She spent the week before Captain Hodges arrived making sure all her records were perfect. Everything was balanced. Everything was documented. Everything was clean. Captain James Hodges arrived on a Monday morning in September 1944. He was younger than Captain Dennison, probably in his mid-30s, with the bearing of someone who had seen combat and lived to tell about it. He had a scar on his left temple and moved with the careful grace of someone whose body had learned to anticipate danger. Maggie gave him the standard briefing on the prisoner management system at Fort Harmony. She showed him the records, the ration adjustments, the behavioral statistics. She presented the data as cleanly and objectively as possible. Hodges listened carefully, asked sharp questions, and took notes. "The morale program seems to be working," he said when she finished. "What's the reasoning behind the dietary changes?" "Positive behavioral reinforcement," Maggie said. "Better morale leads to fewer incidents. Fewer incidents lead to easier management." "And whose idea was it?" he asked. Maggie's heart rate increased. This was the moment. This was where he would decide whether to give credit to Dennison or to dig deeper. "It was developed collaboratively," she said carefully. Hodges looked at her directly. His eyes were gray and very alert. "That's not what I asked," he said. "I asked whose idea it was." Maggie had learned long ago that honesty was less important in the military than appearing confident. She met his gaze steadily. "Captain Dennison approved and implemented it," she said. "It was true, it was just not the whole truth." Hodges looked at her for a long moment, then made a note. He didn't push the question further, but she could tell he had filed it away in his mind. "All right," he said. "It's a good program, I'm going to maintain it, but I want to understand the mechanics. I want to review the budget details. How much is this costing us?" "Approximately $30 per week for the entire prisoner population," Maggie said, which was the official figure but not the complete one. "Out of what budget?" "Miscellaneous supplies and discretionary appropriations." "I see." He stood up from the desk where he had been sitting. "I'll need a detailed breakdown of those appropriations for the past 3 months. I'd like to understand exactly how the money is being allocated." There it was, the moment she had feared. "I can have that ready for you by end of day tomorrow, sir," Maggie said. "Good, thank you, Sergeant. Dismissed." She left his office and went directly to the warehouse. Her hands were shaking as she opened her files. Hodges was going to audit her budget. When he did, he was going to find irregularities. He would probably find evidence of the money she had spent from her own pocket, the careful distribution across multiple line items, the subtle reshuffling of numbers. She had 2 options. She could try to hide it better, which would be increasingly difficult and would probably fail, or she could confess preemptively. Maggie sat in her office for a long time, staring at the wall. Her father had taught her something when she was young. He said that in a corrupt system, honesty is dangerous. But in a system that respects integrity, honesty is power. The trick was figuring out which system you were in. She didn't know what system the Army was. She didn't know what kind of officer Captain Hodges was. But she knew that she couldn't keep lying. The weight of it was getting too heavy. Maggie spent that evening preparing 2 documents. The first was a clean financial breakdown showing the legitimate expenditures as she had presented them. The second was a full accounting of every penny she had spent from her own pocket, every transaction that had been redirected, every slight manipulation of the numbers. She included her reasoning for each one, her intention, her understanding that it violated regulations. She included everything. The next morning, she walked into Captain Hodges' office with both documents. "Sir," she said without preamble, "I've prepared the financial breakdown you requested, but before you review it, I need to tell you something." She handed him the first document. "This is the official accounting." She handed him the second document. "This is the actual accounting. I spent my own money on the prisoner dietary program. I made it work because I believed it was the right thing to do. I am aware that this violated regulations. I am ready to accept the consequences." Hodges took both documents. He read them carefully without speaking. The silence stretched out for what felt like forever. "How much of your own money?" he asked finally. "Approximately $143 over 3 months, Maggie said. Hodges set the documents down. He leaned back in his chair and studied her. "That's roughly 50% of a soldier's monthly salary," he said. "Yes, sir." "Why did you do this?" Maggie had prepared an answer for this question. She had decided honesty was her best option. "Because I spent my childhood going hungry, sir. And I knew what it meant to have someone give you something that showed they valued you, even if it was just a little extra food. I knew what that felt like in the darkest times. I believe the prisoners deserved to feel that too. Even though they're enemies." "Yes, sir, even though they're enemies." Hodges was quiet for a long time. Then he stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the prisoner compound. "I've seen a lot of war," he said. "I've been in places where the enemy was dehumanized so thoroughly that people stopped seeing them as people at all. I watched men do things that should have been impossible to do to another human being. I did things myself that I can't unsee." He turned back to face her. "I made a decision after that. I decided that in whatever small ways I could, I would try to be the kind of person who remembers that everybody, enemy or not, is somebody's son, somebody's brother, somebody's husband. I don't know if it makes a difference in this war, but I know it makes a difference to me. It helps me sleep at night." He sat back down at his desk. "Here's what's going to happen," he said. "You are going to submit a formal request for a dietary program enhancement that I will authorize. I will include it in my recommendations to Colonel Merritt. This will make it official, sanctioned, and budgeted properly. The irregularities in your accounts will be corrected, and we will move forward with this as a legitimate military program." Maggie stared at him. "Sir, I don't understand. I violated." "You violated regulations because the regulations themselves are inadequate," Hodges said. "You saw a problem and solved it in the best way you could with the resources available to you. Now we're going to solve it in the right way. Are we clear?" "Yes, sir, thank you, sir." "One more thing," Hodges said. "I'm going to be asking for a commendation for you, not for the dietary program, that will go in my name, but for your commitment to this base's mission and your innovative thinking about prisoner management. I'm recommending you for promotion to first sergeant." Maggie felt dizzy. A promotion, recognition, legitimacy. "I don't know what to say, sir." "Say you'll keep being the person who thinks about what's right instead of just what's authorized." Over the following weeks, Captain Hodges made good on his word. He presented the dietary program to Colonel Merritt as an official prisoner morale initiative and received commendation for it. Maggie's budget was adjusted to properly account for the costs. The programs that she had been running illegally became official policy. Most importantly, she was promoted to first sergeant. She was the first woman ever to hold that rank at Fort Harmony. But not everyone was happy about it. On the evening after her promotion was announced, Maggie was working late in the warehouse when Captain Wendell Forsyth stormed in. Forsyth was the base's senior logistics officer and had been hostile to Maggie since the day she arrived. He was the kind of officer who believed that women in the military were a mistake, a temporary wartime expediency that needed to be corrected as soon as the war was over. "I want to know what this is about," he said, waving a document. It was her promotion paperwork. "It's my promotion, sir," Maggie said calmly. "To first sergeant, a rank that, as far as I can tell, has never been held by a woman at this installation or any other that I'm aware of." "I believe that's true, sir." "This is a mistake," Forsyth said. "Captain Hodges is new here and doesn't understand the implications of what he's done. He's setting a dangerous precedent. Women don't belong in leadership positions. It undermines military discipline." Maggie stood up from her desk. She was a first sergeant now. That was not a high rank in the grand scheme of things, but it was a rank. She outranked him in some areas. "Sir," she said, her voice steady, "I have been performing my duties at this base for the past 6 months. I have managed the supply chain more efficiently than it was previously managed. I have reduced waste and improved outcomes. I have implemented programs that have enhanced prisoner morale and reduced security incidents. My promotion is based on professional merit." "Your promotion is based on Captain Hodges' questionable judgment," Forsyth said, "and I intend to report this to Colonel Merritt." "That is your right, sir," Maggie said. He left, slamming the door. Maggie sat back down at her desk, her hands shaking now. She had known that the promotion would make enemies. She had known that there were people at this base who would see her success as a threat to their worldview, to their beliefs about how things should be. What she hadn't known was how much it would hurt to be hated simply for existing. The next morning, she was called to Colonel Merritt's office. The colonel looked older than he had when she first arrived at the base. The war was aging all of them. He looked at her over the top of his reading glasses. "Captain Forsyth has raised some concerns about your promotion," he said. "Yes, sir, I'm aware." "He believes it sets a bad precedent. He thinks women in military leadership positions will undermine discipline." "I understand his concern, sir. I would point out that my presence as a supply sergeant has not yet caused any breakdown in discipline. I believe a promotion to first sergeant will similarly have no negative impact on operations." "That's not his only concern," Merritt said. "He's been asking questions about how the prisoner morale program was developed. He's been suggesting that you did something irregular in the budget process." Here it was, the other shoe falling. "I spent some of my own money on the program initially," Maggie said, deciding that complete honesty was her best option. "I felt the program was important, and I wanted to make sure it could be implemented while we waited for proper authorization. Once Captain Hodges arrived, he authorized the program officially and corrected my accounts. Everything is now above board." "I see," Merritt said. He set down his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "Do you know why I was reluctant about your assignment, Sergeant?" "No, sir." "Because I didn't think women belonged here. I thought you would slow things down, cause problems, get other soldiers distracted. I thought you were a waste of military resources when you could have been doing some other job, something more appropriate." Maggie didn't respond. There was nothing to say. "I was wrong," Merritt continued. "I was wrong in exactly the same way that Captain Forsyth is wrong. I let my assumptions about what you could do override what I actually saw you doing. Forsyth hasn't learned that lesson yet." He leaned forward. "Your promotion stands. Your program is sound. Your budget is clean. If Forsyth has a problem with it, that's Forsyth's problem, not yours." "Thank you, sir." "You've done good work here, Hartwell. The kind of work that makes this base better. Keep doing it." Maggie left his office stunned. She had prepared herself for discipline, possibly even dismissal. Instead, she had been validated. She was starting to understand something that she hadn't known before. In a system that values honesty and competence, those things have power. If you do good work and you tell the truth about it, you can't be broken by people who don't believe in you. It was a revelation. That evening, Rodriguez found her in the warehouse. "I heard you made first sergeant," he said, grinning. "That's amazing, Sergeant, you deserve it." "Thank you, Rodriguez." "There's something else, too," he said, his grin fading. "I don't know if you know this, but the prisoners have been talking about you, through the interpreter and stuff. They're grateful for what you did, for the food, for treating them like people." Maggie's throat tightened. "That's kind of them to say." "I thought you should know," Rodriguez said. "I thought it mattered." After he left, Maggie sat alone in the warehouse. She thought about Takeshi Yamamoto, bowing in the darkness. She thought about the prisoners slowly savoring Coca-Cola they probably hadn't tasted in years. She thought about doing the right thing even when no one was watching, even when it was hard, even when it was against the rules. She thought about the fact that the world was full of people who wanted to convince you that kindness was weakness. By October 1944, Fort Harmony had become something different under Captain Hodges' command. There was still discipline, still security, still the fundamental reality of a prisoner of war camp. But there was also a quality of humanity that hadn't existed before. The prisoners were healthier, calmer, less likely to cause trouble. The guards were less tense. The entire base seemed to breathe a little easier. Maggie had settled into her new role as first sergeant. She had an office now, a real one with a door that locked. She had authority over a small team of supply workers. She had a voice in base decisions that affected her area of responsibility. And she was still spending time with Takeshi Yamamoto. It had become a careful routine, one that relied on timing and luck and the understanding that if they were caught, the consequences would be severe for both of them. Takeshi would find reasons to be in the warehouse, usually during the evening inventory shifts when there was minimal supervision. They would talk in low voices while Maggie pretended to work. He told her about his family, a wife, 2 daughters, a son he hadn't seen in 3 years. He told her about Japan, about the cities and the mountains and the way the sea looked at sunrise. He told her about his fears, his certainty that Japan was losing the war, his terror about what would happen to his family when American forces finally invaded the homeland. Maggie told him about her life before the army, about her father and her brothers, about poverty and hunger and the determination that had driven her to be more than her circumstances suggested she could be. "You are very strong," Takeshi said one evening in early October. "Even now in this place where you are not trusted, where people do not want you here, you remain strong." "I don't feel strong," Maggie said. "I feel like I'm one mistake away from everything falling apart." "That is what strength is," Takeshi said. "Continuing forward even when you are afraid. This is what I learned in my training as a soldier, but I did not truly understand it until I became a prisoner. I thought strength was about fighting harder, winning battles, but strength is also about surviving defeat, about maintaining your humanity when everything around you tries to take it away." He paused. "You have done this, you have shown me this." These conversations were dangerous in a way that went beyond the obvious security risk. They were creating a bond, a connection between enemies that shouldn't exist. They were humanizing each other in ways that made the war harder to think about, harder to justify. Maggie knew she should end it. She knew it was a liability. She didn't end it. In mid-October, Captain Forsyth became more aggressive in his campaign against her. He started attending the supply meetings, asking detailed questions about her operations, looking for any inconsistency in her records. He filed formal complaints about the prisoner dietary program, arguing that it violated military regulations about fraternization and prisoner treatment. He even went to Colonel Merritt again, demanding that the program be reviewed. Colonel Merritt shut him down, but Forsyth was not the kind of man to accept defeat. One afternoon, Maggie was called to Captain Hodges' office. He looked troubled, which was unusual for him. "Forsyth has made a serious allegation," Hodges said without preamble. "He claims that you have been fraternizing with one of the prisoners. Specifically, he claims you have had private conversations with a Japanese officer named Takeshi Yamamoto." Maggie's blood turned to ice. "He doesn't have proof," Hodges continued. "But he has witnesses, people who have seen you talking to Yamamoto, people who have reported suspicious behavior in the warehouse." "Sir, Maggie started." "Let me finish," Hodges said. "I know what he's claiming is true, or mostly true. I don't know the details, and I don't want to know the details. What I want to know is whether the information Yamamoto gave you contained anything of military value or security concern." Maggie's mind raced. Takeshi had never told her anything about military installations or operations or anything that could be construed as sensitive information. He had only told her personal things, human things. "No, sir," she said. "Nothing of military concern." "Good," Hodges said. "Here's the situation. Forsyth is going to make a formal accusation. He's filing it with Colonel Merritt. Colonel Merritt is obligated to investigate. You're going to be questioned, possibly court-martialed for fraternization with the enemy." "I understand, sir. You might lose your rank, you might be discharged dishonorably, you might face jail time." "I understand, sir." Hodges stood up and walked to the window. "Do you know why I'm telling you this instead of just letting the formal accusation move forward?" "No, sir." "Because I think Forsyth is right, but for the wrong reasons. You did violate regulations. You did fraternize with a prisoner, and I think it was the right thing to do." He turned back to face her. "I also think that the military, as currently constituted, is not equipped to understand the difference between security risk and humanity. So here's what we're going to do." He sat back down at his desk. "You are going to request a transfer. You are going to say that you want to be reassigned to another base, another role, somewhere else. You're going to do it today, and you're going to do it without telling anyone why. I'll put in my recommendation that you be transferred immediately due to personnel requests at other installations. Sir, if I run... You're not running, Hodges said. You're being transferred. It's an honorable reassignment. Your record will remain clean. Forsyth will have nothing to accuse you of because you won't be here for him to accuse. What about Takshi? Maggie asked. What happens to him when I'm gone? He'll be here when the war ends and then he'll go home, Hodges said. He'll go back to his family. He'll have survived and he'll have known for a brief time in his life that someone cared about his humanity. That's something. In a war like this, that's a lot. Maggie understood what Hodges was doing. He was saving her career, saving her from prosecution, saving her from the consequences of doing the right thing in a system that couldn't afford to acknowledge right and wrong in the way she needed it to. She also understood that she was being asked to abandon Takshi. I need to tell him, she said. No, Hodges said firmly. You don't. You disappear. You're reassigned. You don't see him again. You don't leave a message. You don't give him any warning that could be construed as conspiracy or planning. You simply leave. That's not fair to him. None of this is fair, Hodges said. But fairness is a luxury that people in our position can't afford. What I can do is save your life and career. That's what I'm doing. Maggie realized that she was crying. She hadn't cried since childhood. Tears felt like betrayal. The transfer order will be cut today, Hodges said. You'll leave tomorrow morning. Pack only your personal effects. Anything you want to leave behind, leave it for Rodriguez or the other workers. Yes, sir. I want you to know something, Hodges said as she was leaving. What you did, the kindness, the willingness to risk yourself for people who had no power to help you, that mattered. Don't let Forsyth or anyone else convince you otherwise. That mattered. She left his office in a daze. That evening, Maggie packed her belongings. Everything she owned fit into 2 small suitcases. She had never accumulated much. Her father's daughter, she supposed. You didn't get attached to things when you grew up with nothing. She left her office records in perfect order. She left her files organized. She left no trace of impropriety, no evidence of her conversations with Takshi, no hint of anything irregular. She was very good at covering her tracks now. Around midnight, unable to sleep, she went to the warehouse one last time. She knew she shouldn't. Every instinct told her not to, but she needed to see it one more time, the place where she had learned that she could do something that mattered. Takshi was there. He stepped out of the shadows near the back of the warehouse, as if he had been waiting. I knew, he said. I heard the soldiers talking. I heard your name in connection with an accusation. They are removing you. Tomorrow morning, Maggie said, I'm being transferred. Because of me, Takshi said. Because of what we did, Maggie corrected. Both of us, we did something that matters even though it was against the rules. Takshi was quiet for a long moment. I want you to know something, he said. In the prisoner camp we talk about you. We call you the kind one, the woman who remembered that we are people. I will carry this with me for the rest of my life. When I go home when the war ends, I will tell my family about you. I will tell them that even in war, even between enemies, there is still kindness. There is still humanity. He pulled something from his pocket. It was a small carved figure, a bird, made from wood, intricate and beautiful. I made this, he said. From a scrap of wood. I want you to have it, so that you remember too, so that you remember that what you did was important, that it mattered, that it will not be forgotten. Maggie took the bird. It was warm from being held in his hand. It was the most precious thing anyone had ever given her. Thank you, she said. No, take, she said. I thank you for remembering that I was human, for caring, for risking yourself when you did not have to. He bowed, the deep bow of profound respect and gratitude. Take care of yourself, Maggie said, understanding that this was goodbye. You too, Take, she said. The world needs more people like you, more people who are brave enough to see the humanity in everyone. She left him there in the warehouse and walked back to her quarters. She held the wooden bird carefully, as if it might break if she squeezed too hard. The transfer order was waiting on her bed. She was being sent to a training facility in Tennessee, where she would oversee supply operations for a new military installation that was being built. It was a good assignment, a promotion in all but rank. It was the kind of opportunity that any soldier should be grateful for. Maggie read it and felt nothing but loss. She left Fort Harmony at dawn, driving away in a supply truck before any of the prisoners would wake up. She didn't look back. She couldn't look back. In her jacket pocket, she carried the wooden bird and a weight that felt like it would never lift. Tennessee was cold and gray and entirely different from North Carolina. Maggie threw herself into the work of building the new installation from nothing. She worked 18-hour days, managing supplies for construction crews, coordinating with civilian contractors, building systems and procedures from the ground up. It was the kind of work that could have absorbed her completely if she let it. She tried to let it. But letters kept arriving from Fort Harmony, from Rodriguez and the other workers she had trained. They told her that the prisoner morale program was continuing, that the soldiers were talking about her, that her absence had been noticed. One letter, dated December 1944, came from Captain Hodges himself. "You did your job well," he wrote. "The base continues to run smoothly in your absence, though I think you created very high standards that will be difficult for your replacement to meet. Forsyth has moved on to other preoccupations. The prisoners have settled into their routines. Life continues." The letter said nothing of Takeshi Yamamoto, but Maggie knew that he was there, still a prisoner, still waiting for the war to end. In January 1945, Roosevelt died in office and Harry Truman became president. The war in Europe was winding down, but the war in the Pacific was intensifying. The Americans were island-hopping closer to Japan itself. The casualties were mounting. There was talk of a final invasion of the Japanese mainland, an operation that everyone assumed would be catastrophically bloody for both sides. The prisoners at Fort Harmony, Maggie knew, were increasingly anxious. They had seen the casualty lists. They understood that if America invaded Japan, their families would be in the path of the fighting. Their wives and children might die in the very battles that would free them. It was a bitter kind of captivity, being safe while your home was at war. Maggie had been at the Tennessee installation for 4 months when someone from Fort Harmony came to find her. Captain Hodges walked into her office on a Tuesday morning, travel-worn and serious. "I need to talk to you," he said without preamble, "privately." Maggie closed the door to her office. "It's about Forsyth," Hodges said. "He's been arrested for corruption." Maggie's head came up. "What kind of corruption?" "He was selling supplies to black market dealers in town. Weapons, ammunition, food, medicine, all of it diverted from base inventory. He made over $3,000 in the past 6 months. When Colonel Merritt discovered it, Forsyth tried to cover it up by blaming the discrepancies on you. He claimed you had been embezzling from the supply budget all along, that the prisoner program had been a cover for your theft." "That's insane," Maggie said. "It would have been, except I knew your records. I knew exactly where every penny went, so I had to defend you. Which meant I had to explain about the prisoner program, about your spending from your own money, about your reasons for doing it. Which meant I had to confess that I knew you had done something technically illegal, and I had covered it up." Hodges looked tired. "I'm being court-martialed for covering up your violation of regulations. Forsyth is being court-martialed for embezzlement and corruption. And you, Sergeant, are being exonerated of any wrongdoing." "I don't understand," Maggie said. "You're being court-martialed." "For knowingly tolerating your fraternization with the prisoner," Hodges said. "That's what they're calling it now, officially, knowingly tolerating fraternization with the enemy." "But you saved me." "I did what I thought was right at the time," Hodges said. "And I would do it again. But the cost is that I have to face a court-martial. The Army doesn't like officers who make exceptions to regulations, even when those exceptions are humane." "I'll testify," Maggie said immediately. "I'll tell them that you ordered me to transfer, that you didn't know about the fraternization until Forsyth accused me." "No," Hodges said. "You won't, because the truth is more complicated than that, and I don't want you destroyed by it. You have your career to think about. You have your future. I don't want you sacrificing that for me." "That's not right," Maggie said. "Most things in this war aren't right," Hodges said, "but we do what we can with what we have." He stood to leave. "There's one more thing. Yamamoto was released. Well, transferred, really. The Army is starting to repatriate some of the prisoners as the war winds down in Europe. Yamamoto was on one of the first transport ships. He's going home." Maggie felt something shift inside her, a kind of peace that she hadn't expected. "When?" she asked. "He left Fort Harmony 2 weeks ago. He'll arrive in Japan in probably another 3 weeks, assuming the ship makes it across without being torpedoed." Will he survive if America invades? I don't know, Hodges said. I hope so. I hope he makes it home to his family. I hope he tells them about you. I hope he remembers that in the middle of a terrible war, one American soldier cared enough about his humanity to risk her career. After Hodges left, Maggie sat alone in her office. She held the wooden bird which she kept on her desk always, and she allowed herself to hope that somewhere across an ocean that was still full of war and danger, Takeshi Yamamoto was going home. The court-martial of Captain James Hodges took place in March 1945. Maggie was not allowed to testify, per Hodges' request and the military's determination to keep the case narrowly focused. The trial lasted 3 days. The verdict was guilty. Hodges was dishonorably discharged from the Army. When Maggie heard the news, she felt as though something inside her had broken. She wrote him a letter, though she didn't know where to send it. She left it with a chaplain at the Tennessee installation, along with her request that it somehow reach him. I know you don't want my gratitude, she wrote, but I owe you something that gratitude doesn't begin to cover. You took a risk to protect me. You stood up for what was right, even when it cost you everything. The world needs more people like you. I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to be more like you. I'm going to make sure that what you did wasn't wasted. She didn't know if he ever received the letter. She never heard from him again. But everything changed after that. Within days of Hodges' conviction, articles started appearing in the newspapers. A journalist from Ashford, the nearest town to Fort Harmony, had been investigating the court-martial. He had uncovered the story of Captain Hodges' sacrifice, his willingness to be destroyed for the sake of humanity toward prisoners of war. The story spread, first through North Carolina, then through national newspapers. Military officer dishonorably discharged for showing compassion to enemy prisoners. Read one headline. Soldier destroyed for kindness. The story of Captain James Hodges. Read another. The public outcry was immediate and overwhelming. Thousands of letters poured into the War Department, demanding that Hodges be exonerated, that the charges be reviewed, that the conviction be overturned. Congressmen called for inquiries. Senators demanded explanations. The Army, embarrassed and unable to resist the political pressure, quietly reopened the case. And suddenly, the story of what had actually happened at Fort Harmony came out. The dietary program for prisoners. The reasonable concerns about morale and security. The fact that Hodges had been pursuing a legitimate military objective, improving prisoner treatment to reduce security incidents. What also came out was Maggie's role in developing the program. The newspapers identified her as a female supply sergeant who pioneered the humane treatment program. They called her brave and forward-thinking. They reported that she had been unfairly transferred to prevent her from testifying at Hodges' trial. They called the entire situation a travesty of military justice. Maggie watched it all happen from her small office in Tennessee, stunned. She received orders in April 1945 to report to the War Department in Washington. She was being called to testify before a military inquiry. She was being asked to tell the truth about what had happened at Fort Harmony. This time, she decided, she would tell the complete truth. When she arrived in Washington, she was escorted to a hearing room where military officials and congressional representatives were gathered. She was sworn in. She was asked to state her name and rank. First Sergeant Margaret Hartwell, she said, Supply Division, United States Army. For the next hour, she told the story. She told them about her first months at Fort Harmony, about the disrespect she had endured, about the way she had been underestimated and mocked. She told them about identifying a problem with prisoner morale and developing a solution. She told them about Captain Dennison approving the program without really understanding what she had done. She told them about Captain Hodges arriving and giving her the choice between confession and running. She told them about Hodges' decision to help her anyway, to protect her, to risk his own career for the sake of someone he barely knew. And she told them about fraternizing with Takeshi Yamamoto. The room went very quiet. You admit to violating military regulations regarding fraternization with prisoners, the military panel chair said. I do, Maggie said. I knew it was against regulations. I did it anyway because I believed it was right. And you discussed classified military information with this prisoner. No, I discussed my life, my family, my thoughts and feelings. He discussed his life, his family, his fears. We discussed nothing of military value. We discussed our shared humanity. You don't think that was fraternization? I think, Maggie said carefully, that we were two human beings in an impossible situation, trying to remember that we were people and not just soldiers on opposite sides of a war. The panel exchanged looks. First Sergeant Hartwell, the chair said, do you regret violating military regulations? Maggie thought carefully before answering. I regret that the regulations exist in a form that makes it impossible to treat prisoners with humanity, she said. I regret that I had to break rules to do what I believed was right, but I do not regret what I did. And you believe Captain Hodges acted appropriately in protecting you? Captain Hodges recognized that the regulations themselves were inadequate, Maggie said. He recognized that a good military officer sometimes has to make hard choices to preserve the humanity of his soldiers and the people in his care. He chose to protect me rather than destroy me, and he paid for that choice with his career. The hearing ended. Maggie was thanked and dismissed. 3 weeks later, the military inquiry issued its findings. Captain Hodges' conviction was overturned. He was offered reinstatement at his full rank. He declined the reinstatement but accepted a full exoneration. Maggie received her own commendation for her work developing the prisoner morale program. She received a promotion to Master Sergeant. She received a letter from the Secretary of War thanking her for her service. But more important than any of that, she received a letter from Japan. It was dated May 1945, written in careful English from Takeshi Yamamoto. I returned home safely, he wrote. My wife and daughters were alive, though my son was wounded in the fighting and died from his injuries before I could reach him. My country is defeated, but I am alive. My family survived, and I owe some of that to you. He had written about his return to civilian life, about rebuilding his house from the rubble of American bombing, about the shock of living in a country that had lost everything. And he had written about remembering her kindness. Many times when things were very dark, he wrote, I thought of the sandwich and the Coca-Cola. I thought of the woman who cared enough to risk her career to treat me with respect. And I felt less alone. I felt like the world was not completely cruel. You gave me that gift. I will never forget it. Maggie read the letter over and over. She held the wooden bird and the letter together and cried for the first time since childhood, long and hard and with relief. She had been broken by the system. She had been sacrificed by some and saved by others. She had been called a traitor and a hero, sometimes by the same people on the same day. The war ended in September 1945, when Japan formally surrendered. The photographs showed American soldiers raising flags over destroyed cities, walking through the rubble of Japanese towns, meeting Japanese citizens who had survived the fighting. Maggie watched it all on newsreels and thought about Takeshi, rebuilding his life in that rubble. She continued her service in the army, through the occupation of Japan, through the restructuring of the post-war military. She was eventually offered the opportunity to be commissioned as an officer to become Captain Margaret Hartwell. She accepted. The newspapers called her a pioneer. Female officers were rare then and rarer still in supply and logistics. But Maggie had proven herself beyond doubt. She had survived scrutiny and scandal. She had been vindicated by history and by the people whose lives she had touched. Captain Hodges, meanwhile, left the military. Maggie learned through mutual acquaintances that he had taken a job with a humanitarian organization that was helping to rebuild war-torn Europe. He was using his skills and his philosophy, the belief that humans deserve to be treated with dignity even in the worst circumstances, to help people who had been broken by the war. They met once by accident in 1947 in Washington at a veterans event. They shook hands like acquaintances, made small talk like people who had never known each other well. But in that handshake, Maggie felt a recognition that went deeper than words could reach. They had been through something together. They had each paid a price for believing in something that the system didn't recognize. I've read your reports, Hodges said quietly. The ones about prison camp management and prisoner welfare. They're being used as guidelines for how other installations should operate. They're making a difference. I learned from a good teacher, Maggie said. We learned from each other, Hodges said. In 1952, Maggie received another letter from Japan. It was from the wife of Takeshi Yamamoto. Takeshi had died, she wrote, from complications of wounds he had sustained during the war. But before he died, he had asked his wife to contact Maggie and tell her something. My husband spoke of you often, the letter said, translated into English by an interpreter. He told us that you showed him kindness when kindness was dangerous. He told us that you proved to him that even in war, human beings could choose compassion. He wanted you to know that this memory sustained him through the darkness of the post-war years. He wanted you to know that your act of kindness lived in his heart until the end. Maggie held the letter and the wooden bird together. She had carried them with her for almost 8 years. She carried them the rest of her life. She retired from the Army in 1960 as Colonel Margaret Hartwell. She had been one of the first women to achieve that rank. She had served her country faithfully, guided by the belief that treating people with humanity was not weakness, it was strength. She wrote a memoir that was published in 1962. It told the story of Fort Harmony, of her struggles to be respected in a military that didn't believe in women, of her conviction that prisoners of war were still human beings deserving of dignity. She wrote about Takeshi Yamamoto without revealing his real name, but everyone who had been at Fort Harmony knew who he was. She wrote about Captain Hodges and the cost of doing the right thing. The memoir was reviewed as a powerful testament to the possibility of humanity in an inhuman war. More importantly, it changed policy. The Army began implementing formal training in prisoner welfare. They established guidelines that were more humane than military law had previously required. They incorporated Maggie's ideas about the connection between prisoner morale and security into their official doctrine. She had changed the system from the inside. In 1965, Maggie returned to Fort Harmony, which was now much smaller than it had been during the war. Most of it had been converted to other uses, but the warehouse where she had worked still stood. She walked through it alone, remembering. She stood in the spot where Takeshi had bowed to her. She stood in the office where she had done her paperwork, where she had carefully made 2 and 2 add up to 5 to help people who had no power to help themselves. She stood in the darkness and let the memories wash over her. She thought about all the people who had tried to convince her that what she did didn't matter. They had called her naive and idealistic and foolish. They had told her that the military wasn't concerned with individual human beings, only with operations and outcomes and national security. But she had learned something that they had missed. Operations and outcomes and national security are all built on individual human beings. And if you treat people like they matter, if you invest in their humanity, they become better people. They become less likely to hurt others. They become more likely to remember kindness and pass it on. Kindness was not weakness. Kindness was a choice that required more strength than cruelty ever would. In 1978, when Maggie was 57 years old, she received a visitor at her home in Virginia. It was a man who identified himself as Toshiro Yamamoto, the grandson of Takeshi Yamamoto. "My grandfather told my father about you," Toshiro said in accented English. "My father told me. Now I wanted to meet you and thank you in person." Maggie welcomed him into her home. She showed him the wooden bird that her grandfather had carved. She told him the story, though she suspected his father or grandfather had already told him most of it. "My grandfather said," Toshiro told her, "that you saved his life. Not because you gave him food or protected him, but because you proved to him that he was still a human being. That even in war, even as an enemy, he was worth something. That he was worth being kind to." "Your grandfather was a human being," Maggie said. "That was never in question." "Perhaps not to you," Toshiro said. "But to many people at that time in that place it was very much in question. My grandfather was not a person. He was an enemy soldier, a prisoner, a potential security threat. And yet you saw him as a person. That was rare. That was brave. That changed his life." They spent the afternoon together. Toshiro told her about his father, about the family that had rebuilt itself after the war, about the fact that Takeshi's story had been passed down through generations as an example of what was possible when people chose kindness over conformity. "In Japan," Toshiro said as he was leaving, "we have a concept called gammon. It means to endure with patience and dignity. My grandfather endured the war, the capture, the loss of his son, but he endured with the memory of your kindness. That made it bearable. That is what I wanted you to know. That is what my family wanted me to tell you." After he left, Maggie sat in her living room, holding the wooden bird, and understood finally what she had done. She had not changed the war. She had not stopped the fighting or prevented deaths or altered the course of history. What she had done was much smaller and much larger at the same time. She had treated one person with humanity. She had chosen kindness when she could have chosen cruelty or indifference. And that choice had rippled forward through time, touching people she would never meet, changing lives in ways she would never know. She had learned over the course of her long life that that was enough. That was everything. Maggie lived another 16 years after Toshiro's visit. She spent them writing letters, speaking at military colleges about ethics and leadership, and most importantly, spending time with young people who were struggling to find their way in a world that didn't always respect them. She was the first woman to address the Armed Forces Leadership School as a keynote speaker. She was the first woman to lead a seminar on the ethics of military command at West Point. She was the first woman to serve on the board of directors of the National War Museum. And everywhere she went, she told the same story. She told it about a sandwich and a Coca-Cola. She told it about a Japanese prisoner and an American soldier. She told it about the cost of being kind in a system that rewarded cruelty or indifference. She told it about how one small act of humanity could live in someone's heart forever, could shape their entire experience of suffering, could remind them that the world was not completely dark. She told young military officers that their job was not just to win battles. Their job was to lead human beings, to make choices that would honor the dignity of the people they commanded and the people they encountered. She told them that history would not remember them for the battles they won, but for whether they maintained their humanity while fighting. Many of those young officers came back to her, years later, to tell her that her words had shaped their entire military career. They had made decisions differently because of something she said. They had treated prisoners with dignity because of her example. They had remembered that the enemy they were fighting was still a human being. One of those officers was present in the hospital room on the day that Maggie Hartwell died in 1994 at the age of 73. He held her hand and told her that he had just returned from a deployment to Eastern Europe, where his command had been operating under rules of engagement that emphasized humanitarian treatment of the enemy. He told her that he knew, without any doubt, that this would not have been possible without her. "You changed the entire trajectory of how we think about military ethics," he told her. "You changed it with a sandwich and a Coca-Cola." Maggie smiled. "I changed it by refusing to stop seeing people as people," she said. "That was the only special thing I did." After she died, her letters were published. Her speeches were compiled into a book. Her story became part of military history, an example of how individual soldiers could shape policy and ethics through the integrity of their choices. But perhaps more important than all of that was what Takeshi Yamamoto had done with the memory of her kindness. After the war, Takeshi had become an educator in Japan, teaching young people about the importance of cross-cultural understanding and peaceful conflict resolution. He had told his students about the American soldier who had shown him kindness during his captivity. He had used her example as a lesson about what was possible when people chose compassion over hatred. His teachings had influenced a generation of Japanese students who became teachers themselves, carrying forward the message that human beings could choose to treat each other with dignity, even in the worst circumstances. By some measures, the ripples of that one act of kindness reached millions of people. Not all of them knew the original source of the ripple, but they felt its effect nonetheless. And that was enough. Years after Maggie's death, a Japanese television network produced a documentary about her life and her friendship with Takeshi Yamamoto. The documentary was called The Taste of America, named after the way Takeshi had described the Coca-Cola and sandwich to his family. It won international awards. It was shown in schools in both America and Japan as a lesson about the possibility of humanity in war. In the United States, where Maggie was already celebrated as a pioneer in military leadership, the documentary revealed a different side of her story. It showed not just the ambitious officer, but the young woman who had been willing to break the rules to do what was right. It showed the cost of integrity. It showed that sometimes being brave meant being willing to lose everything. The Army, by this time transformed by decades of civil rights reforms and gender equality initiatives that Maggie herself had helped to pioneer, officially recognized her contributions to military ethics. A new program was established in her name, dedicated to training military officers in compassionate leadership. Fort Harmony, which had been decommissioned in 1948, was preserved as a historical site. The warehouse where Maggie had worked became a museum dedicated to prisoner-of-war policy during World War II. Visitors came from all over the world to learn about the remarkable young woman who had insisted on treating prisoners like human beings. In that museum, alongside artifacts from the war and documents about military policy, they displayed two items that had been donated by Maggie's estate. The first was a bottle of Coca-Cola, preserved in glass, looking exactly as it must have looked in 1944 when Maggie distributed them to the prisoners. The second was the wooden bird that Takshi had carved. The museum guide would tell visitors the story, how a sandwich and a Coca-Cola had changed two lives, how one woman's insistence on treating an enemy with dignity had rippled forward through generations, how kindness, in a time of war, had been a revolutionary act. These two items, the guide would say, represent something fundamental about human nature. They show that even in the darkest times, when nations are at war and enemies are dehumanized, there are people who choose to see the humanity in others. There are people who are willing to risk everything for kindness. There are people who understand that the small acts matter, that they live on, that they shape the world in ways we can never fully know. And that was the real story of Fort Harmony. It was not a story about military strategy or prisoner management or the logistics of war. It was a story about one woman who had been told she didn't belong, who had been mocked and underestimated and disrespected. A woman who had responded by being better. A woman who had used her competence not just to advance her own career, but to improve the lives of people who had no power to help themselves. It was a story about how integrity and kindness could survive in a broken system. How one person could change the system itself by refusing to compromise their humanity. It was a story about the power of a sandwich and a Coca-Cola to remind someone that they were still a human being. And it was a story that would live on, told and retold, long after everyone who had lived through the war had passed away. Because what Maggie Hartwell had understood and what she had taught by her example was that kindness is not small. Kindness is powerful. Kindness is revolutionary. And kindness, once given, never dies. It lives on in the hearts of the people who receive it, and it spreads outward, touching lives in ways the giver will never fully know.